All right, so obviously there's a bunch of people talking about how there's been a recent release of information related to this guy named Peter Thiel, or I don't know how to pronounce his name, doesn't really matter. Just typical kind of elite shenanigans, right? Some kind of retreat where a bunch of powerful, interconnected global elites get together and do a bunch of shady things, right? And people are talking, of course, about all the content of these things, and I what I want to focus on right now is not so much some of the specific things being discussed or brought forward, but kind of more generally asking us to think a little bit more carefully about things like this when they happen, right? So it's easy to sit back there and say, oh my God, look, there's just this leak or this hack or this dump of information, okay? And there's a tendency to just take that at face value and assume that that's genuinely speaking what's happening. Assume that someone is actually trying to divulge this information or someone is trying to dig up this information, acting in good faith and getting it out to the public. But it might also be the case sometimes that when these things get released out, that they're being done so intentionally, right? It could be that some of the information perhaps is misleading or perhaps just downright untrue. I'll give you kind of a quick little example, right? So, one of the things that is discussed in a lot of these leaking documents related to this recent retreat is this idea of preparing for World War III, for example. And that's a common thing that you hear a lot of people talk about, the possibility of World War III coming and so on and so forth, and global elites building bunkers and this and that. But I want to ask you, does that really make a lot of sense on a more basic level, right? Like, we're dealing with these very powerful, absolutely at this point, very global oligarchical forces. And that's not to say that they're perfectly and totally unified in every way, shape, and form. I certainly do believe that there is a vast global sort of corporate interconnected conspiracy of sorts. Don't get me wrong, I certainly do believe in occult societies and all this and that. However, I also think that there are different groups sometimes jockeying for a little bit of power, so it's a little bit difficult to say exactly how monolithic what we're dealing with is. But there's a possibility that it's very monolithic, for example. The idea of World War III would more suggest that either it's not as monolithic as perhaps certain forces want you to think, or it would suggest that that's something that the powers that be want, right? And of course, that makes sense. We know throughout all ages, the powers that be have always used war and divide and conquer strategies, encouraging militarism and conflict between groups and nations and cultures and religions and whatnot, nationalities, ideologies, as a way to gain more centralized political control, right? Playing all these different groups off against each other. So certainly that's a possibility too, but do you really think that all of these powerful global elites really want to live underground? I think that it's much more likely they just want to continue the current state of affairs, this kind of constant low level sustainable warfare, right? There's been tons of warfare since World War II, even despite the founding of the United Nations and the era of Western and American democracy and idealism and all the promise of Wilson and FDR and all of these things, right? Did that really come about? Or even after the end of the Cold War, right? Even so, there's still been quite a bit of warfare since World War II. Now, it may not be traditional kind of major power wars. Certainly, nuclear weapons have put a damper on that, but it's not like there's an absence of war. Anyways, I could riff on this independently, and certainly we'll talk more about warfare and some of these interesting dynamics in their own right at some point. But getting back to the main point, when we get these leaks, right, coming out purporting to tell us all this information, especially about powerful elites and what they're thinking and doing and this and that. It's just important to remember that it's possible that some of that information is being manufactured or at least manipulated and massaged in a certain way. And that some of these so-called leaks are just more controlled opposition, really, right? And I'm going to talk specifically about controlled opposition more very soon, okay? And so a lot of what appears to be some kind of genuine whistleblowing or attempt to shining the light or shining anything on all this shenanigans might in fact be more shenanigans. And so you just have to be very careful, right? And I think with something like World War III, I feel like there's a strong interest among the propaganda department within the global oligarchical elite. There are various different intelligence units, whatever you want to call them, right? To kind of encourage this idea of potential cataclysmic global conflict. Because it sort of gets people not really very hopeful about the future. And it sort of distracts them, I think. Maybe it also gets them to think that there's more than a few players, right? That there could actually be some genuine conflict, right? And I'm not saying exactly that there couldn't be. Even if there is a loose, monolithic global corporate order closely tied to deeper and more ancient occult forces. And I think there certainly is. I think everything I just said is accurately describing more or less the situation. Doesn't mean that everyone is always perfectly on the same page, right? And I like to mention fiction a lot to come up with some examples, right? Some analogies. And when we think about like Sauron, right, and Mordor, and Saruman and Isengard, right? Kind of on the same team, more or less working together, but at the same time, Saruman kind of wants to supplant Sauron, and Sauron doesn't exactly trust Saruman, probably, as much as it might seem. As Gandalf said, right, there's only one Lord of the Ring, and he does not share power. So to that extent, yes, I think there is always the potential for dissension, even among the ranks of a superficially highly monolithic and regulated conspiracy. And I think that's, again, a very accurate description of what we're dealing with at this point. I think it's certainly since World War I congealed into something a lot more impressive than anything that existed before. And that has a lot to do with technology and other things, and I'll talk more about that in the future. But just keep these things in mind, right? Not everything that comes out, even a thing that's leaking or supposedly pulling back the curtain, right, is necessarily what it purports to be. And I think that what they like to do more than anything is mix truth with lies, right? Because when you mix truth with lies, you can sort of sell some of the lies. You put them in a truth sandwich and people are more willing to eat them. So sometimes I do think the powers that be even do release information about themselves that is true and highly criminal in nature. And partly also I think they do this because it amuses them as well, but it's also because they're mixing it in with other things, other pieces of information that they're putting out there that are not true. So they'll tell you some of the things that they're doing, and you'll know that and you'll feel that, but then they'll also throw out these other things, right, and try to mix it in. The irony of conspiracy theories is that the majority of conspiracy theories were, in fact, probably created by intelligence agencies, right? They're the ones creating probably the most disinformation, misinformation about their own activities. Even though, ironically, of course, that in and of itself further points towards what's obvious to most of us, which is there is a roughly monolithic corporate oligarchical occult conspiratorial order. Just pick all the words, throw them in whatever order you want. You know what I'm talking about. We know what it is. Powers that be. So, it could be that some of this information that we just got is true. It certainly sounds right. Building a cult, all sorts of weird sex stuff about being famous and powerful, and sure, that all sounds like something they would do. I don't know. It could be. Maybe they are planning some kind of low-level World War III. I can't say for sure they're not. I'm just saying, keep an open mind about these things. Much of the information that comes out is not necessarily trustworthy. And much of the opposition is not truly opposition. Don't worry, though. You got me, at least. I may not have much of an audience, but I am on your side, at least. Many blessings. Thank you for watching this video. I want you to know that I love you very much, and that God loves you very much. Let's keep doing our best. I'll see you again very soon. Good night.